Welcome to the Basic Income Show. I'm your host, Scott Santens. I'm here with my co-hosts and friends, Josh Worth and Conrad Shaw, where we talk about just the latest developments in the world of universal basic income. And it's been about 3 weeks since the last one. We've got plenty of stuff to talk about. But I think even though we talked about this last week, I want to start off just by talking a little bit again about the news out of South Korea, because it's just such a, I don't know, it's a pretty big deal, I think. And so South Korea is doing a huge rural basic income pilot. And we're talking like, over 200,000 people across South Korea will be part of this. Yeah, so it's launching in 7 counties, and they'll be getting 150,000 won per month in local love gift certificates. So if they were to actually make this a fully national thing, we'd have to have that debate. Did South Korea actually implement universal basic income? Because it's not actually cash. So even if it's universal, unconditional, and monthly and provided to every individual, if they're using this kind of voucher, then it's not technically universal basic income. It's more of a local currency. You can use it on most everything. It's just all your local businesses can accept it. And then it's just like you can't buy stuff in other provinces and stuff. So it's localized, but it's very cash-like, even though it's not technically cash. 150,000 won per month works out to about $180 per month in purchasing power parity. But yeah, this is across the entire counties, and but not cities. So this is a rural basic income pilot. They're specifically focused on rural areas, and they're actually hoping to actually draw people or at least keep people in these rural areas. Like they feel that too many people are leaving the rural areas for cities, and that's a problem. And so they actually want to incentivize people to stay in rural areas. So because if we did something like this in the US, there'd be kind of more of a political strategy to that, like saying, well, let's focus on rural areas because maybe it can build up support among conservatives by making sure that they actually experience this. But here it's less about like that and more about actually helping and sustaining these rural areas in South Korea.
I mean, it's interesting. Like I have this discussion with people all the time, like regarding cost of living, for example. Cost of living in cities is more than in rural or in small or medium-sized towns. And a lot of it's because there's so much population pressure, people moving in there for the added earning potential there or career or just purpose or whatever you get in cities. And that inflates the rents in the cities. And one of the arguments for like why it should be a universal same size basic income everywhere and not somehow like calibrated to cost of living in the individual cities is because a basic income would go further in a rural area or a small town, and so for the same reasons would incentivize people to stay in their hometowns. When if there's someone who left just because they didn't think they could make enough money to get by in their local area, now they could, and they would stay where they wanted to stay and reduce the rent inflation pressures in the cities and support all of these middle America towns and having more vibrant economies. And you don't have to theoretically target it to rural and small towns for that to happen. You can just lean on the fact that it goes further in these places. So yeah, it's interesting to me to see them like very specifically only targeting counties and rural stuff. And it's limited. They can't do universal. So maybe that they're just kind of leaning into that. But I don't think it's necessary potentially. And like including a city and a rural area next to each other, you might actually get to measure that incentive to like now go live where you grew up and be with family, and now there's a more viable route to having a business or like doing whatever you want to do there.
There's
In this
some
case,
kind
they're
of
not going to get to see that, except you might see people leaving the cities to try to get to be part of this program, I guess, but that's not a really great test.
Yeah, with
Yeah.
like $180 per month, it seems unlikely for people to flee cities to go there. But yeah, I mean, it's possible.
As far as
Well-
like strategies for building up rural regions, like it's pretty good. Like this is like they're saying like we want to put money into these areas to build them up. And so here's the money, and we've also made it so that the money can only be spent in those areas. So it's like it's pretty solid if that's like the intention.
Yeah. 'Cause, like right now, I would say SSI is doing a lot for rural areas, but like in the wrong way. These these rural areas in all over the country in the US, like there's a lot of people on disability via SSI, and you're not allowed, really to earn extra income. So like, you get the income and you spend it on food or whatever in the that local area. But like it can't really like build jobs off that because you can't really accept jobs. So yeah, like UBI would just do so much for these rural areas across the US where not only are you like enabling people, like everyone in those areas to buy stuff locally, but then everyone is actually allowed to take jobs and build incomes on top of those incomes. Whereas right now it's like a ceiling over all these rural areas versus a floor that
Right.
UBI would be.
Or produce stuff locally, like little subsistence farms. If you got an acre rather than, a studio, you can actually grow some food for yourself and your community if you want. And we've seen, like in our program, we saw someone doing that who was living more rural. And it kind of reminds me though of this argument I was making before reminds me of having similar feelings about the rise of remote work and should that bring down costs of rent, like if people are moving out of the cities and able to work remote. And it doesn't seem like it is. It's hard to know what it would have been otherwise, but it just kind of points out to me that like these economic trends that you would predict um are sort of unreliable when you have sort of an uncompetitive market or a coercive market. Like in the end, and this comes up a lot, the question of why wouldn't landlords just gobble it up? And it's like, I think they would, just like they already do, if we don't have appropriate legislation and regulation to keep people from gobbling up that land and that resource.
Well, yeah, when things like work from home, like there was so much opportunity there where we actually got to see that in action during COVID. And then employers were like, ooh, we hate this. Like, we can't have all these vacant offices and stuff, but we're going to force you to come back to the office. And even if they don't force them to come back to the office 5 days a week, maybe they force them to come back 2 days out of the week, versus five. And so if you're being forced to come back to the office at least sometime, then you lose out on all that ability to, move to more rural areas to save on rent. So, we would have seen a lot more actual competition, between rural and urban areas if employers weren't forcing people to spend, at least 2 days in the office. If we leaned into the ability to do full work from home, and for a lot of these jobs, yeah, I think we would have seen more of that. I think we would have seen like cities get cheaper, and these other areas like even
Yeah,
just a
I
bit more
mean,
expensive.
if you make the places like near a city more attractive to live, then you'll probably end up with having a bit of an exodus of workers if they're able to. Like if they do have jobs where they don't have to go into an office, then like and there's an attractive place that's less expensive, then yeah, people might want to go out of the cities and then you got like less competition for the housing, so the housing's a little more affordable. So like it's a decent strategy. And I think, personally, like I kind of lived this life. Like I was living in a very rural remote town and during COVID and I was working and really had no need to be in a city except for the fact that like just the town itself was like kind of lacking, right? Like if you needed to just get groceries, you'd have to drive 20 minutes. If you wanted to like go to go to the Lowe's to get something to like fix your house up, you had to drive in a half hour. Like so you are I think what Conrad was saying earlier about like isolating these like rural areas from the urban connections is maybe not the best way to do it. Cause like the reality is like if you wanted somebody to come and like do some work on your place or something, or like if somebody was like, you know what, I want to build up a restaurant and I want to like, get the infrastructure for that. Like, they couldn't be done locally. You had to like reach out to neighboring cities. Like you'd had to find people in like, this Western New York, like Rochester or Ithaca or something to come like where there was some actual resources. But the town itself had very few of its own resources. And so like, I think even if money had gone into it, uh, and that money could only be spent locally, like there's only so much you can spend it on, you know, to truly build up an area, you have to allow that money to be spent like wherever, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think we'd all agree that it would be better if South Korea were doing full universal, including cities, and also full on cash instead of vouchers. But it's the fact that it's still just such a huge number of people across 7 counties. We'll see, I think, some good impacts. One other thing I wanted to mention too about this news I thought was interesting that was in this piece is so the way they're paying for this. So the total project cost over 2 years, 886 billion won, and of this, 327.8 billion won will be supported by national funds, and the rest will be invested from local government budgets. So you're looking at about 550 billion won local projects. So it's kind of like if we did something similar in the U.S., it would be like spending $1 billion to do a 2-year pilot across Wyoming that excludes the cities. And so it'd be like everyone in Wyoming would get this. And then like Wyoming would have to pay about, let's say, I don't know what this works out to, but like 2/3 or so of the cost. And then the federal government, the US government would donate about a third. So the question here is, well, these areas that come up with this money. So I thought it was cool how I highlighted this region. Some regions are using profits from renewable energy generation, such as solar and wind power, as a source of basic income. In the case of Shannan in South Jeolla Province, a plan was proposed on October 2nd to share profits from operating power generation facilities with all residents through an agreement between the residents' cooperative and the county. Yongyang in North Gyeong Province plans to use wind power generation funds as a source for rural basic income. So, like, one province is using solar, one province is using wind power. To help fund this pilot. I don't know. It's neat that you can actually make that connection to clean power dividends as a kind of basic income.
I mean, that's a great source for it as like something from the commons, something that is
Yeah.
sort of bestowed on all of us, a natural resource that we should all be able to share. Like, shouldn't be captured by like a specific set of corporations, at least not entirely. And it's sustainable so like the Alaska model where it's based on oil revenue, like there's always like a little bit of a bittersweet pill there where it's like, great, everyone's getting a basic income, but it's tied to oil extraction, which, is finite and is arguably detrimental. So there's a little bit of push and pull there. Whereas solar and wind power,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Although
renewable basic
just
income.
as an asterisk to the Alaska one, it's interesting how the purpose of the fund was to put this oil money into a permanent fund and then to grow that fund over time. That fund is invested in like the markets and draws a return from those investments. And so like at this point in time, there's so much money in the fund that the bulk of the dividend is actually coming from just the investments of the fund and not like actual oil revenue. So yeah, like the basis of it is oil revenue, but even at this point, it's really just a giant fund that's being invested in stuff. So the revenue is coming from all sorts of things, that's being invested in instead of just like oil money. But just an interesting detail. Okay, so the next thing, since we're talking about South Korea's pilot, a pilot project bill has been reintroduced in our own Congress. Not that it would ever be passed the way things currently are, but it's nice to see lawmakers actually, saying, hey, we should actually do a nationwide basing experiment. And the details of this has been reintroduced by New Jersey's Bonnie Watson Coleman, and it's got 9 co-sponsors, and it would involve 20,000 Americans, and half of them, so 10,000, would receive the monthly income for 3 years. And what's different about this one, and I don't necessarily like this detail, and we can talk about this, but it's not a set amount of money. The payments would vary according to the person and where they live. It would cover the local cost of a two-bedroom apartment in that person's zip code. So, I don't see anything, going through the bill about, trying in any specific area. So it's not like, they're suggesting we should do Wyoming, like I mentioned earlier. Instead, I think it would just be 10,000 people either all across the country or maybe in a few states or, I don't know. But like the payments would vary quite a bit. If you're living in New York City, then the cost of a two-bedroom apartment there is going to be a lot more than if you were in, rural Wyoming, Kentucky, West Virginia, these kinds of areas. And so, there's a certain unfairness to that, I think, too. And there's also, I think it hurts the potential of the study too, because like you're not going to scale it up. Like you're not going to scale it up to a basic income where people living in really nice places get a lot more money than everyone else. And it's, that's a lot more expensive. Like we should be able to test what is this amount. And then, oh, that amount works well all across the country. Well, let's scale that up. But here, you're not doing that.
Right. It's overcomplicating it unnecessarily and muddying the results where I'm sympathetic to the idea of cost of living and like a UBI could be bigger in certain areas, but I think the way to approach that is to have like a national level that is all uniform, like kind of like how they do a federal like national minimum wage. Not that I'm endorsing minimum wage exactly as it is, but and then in like New York City, the New York City minimum wage is larger than the federal minimum wage, right? And that's part of like legislating how much you have to pay. But like if you had $1,000 a month or $1,200 a month across the nation, and then that was going to everyone in New York City as well, then New York City could have its own taxes to bump it up another few $100 on its own. Like that can happen at the local level. You shouldn't task like this national universalistic, well, it wouldn't be as universalistic if you're doing this. You shouldn't task them with like determining everyone's level of cost of living. You should give a baseline, kind of like the federal minimum wage, and just
And
say
this is,
everyone starts here. And then that allows people to be like, okay, still, like, I'm in New York City. I'm getting $1,000 a month that pays half my rent, but I have more opportunities here. But also, if I went back home, I could, start that muffin shop that I've been wanting to start or whatever, rather than just trying to make a value judgment for people on where they live, I guess.
yeah, like it's interesting to contrast this to what South Korea is doing with rural only, where this really directly subsidizes landlords in expensive cities. A landlord they've already set the price, and then we're saying, oh, well, we'll pay that, whatever it is, and then they can just, oh, well, we'll just raise this a little bit more, and then, oh, well, we said we were going to do, two-bedroom medians, so we'll pay that too. Like it's just directly going right to those landlords. It doesn't matter. There's no competition between them and cheaper areas. But yeah, that's the benefit of having this fully universal amount across cities and rural areas is
Right.
that it goes much further in a rural area.
Yeah, like this approach kind of like really raises that whole question of like, well, if we all have basic income, won't rents just go up? Like this is like we can by raising rent, we will raise the basic income, right? Like tying it directly to it is kind of like speaking a little
It's an
bit
incentive.
too closely to that whole possible question, right? Like it's tying the rent to the amount is very like it's kind of short-sighted. It's like somebody's heard
Yeah.
somebody asked them that question. They're like, well, okay, yeah, why don't we just like attach it to the amount of the rent in the area?
Right.
It's kind of like not very well thought through.
That's kind of leaning into the political headwinds of the day where like a two-bedroom apartment is like a common thing that people think of and framing around. But if you're basically paying everybody's rent around the country, then the government is now incentivized to keep rents down. which I think they should be to a degree. I think it should be regulated to it, but enough to make it a fair and competitive market. If the government is the end all be all last stop for basically paying everyone's minimum rent, then you would see a lot more regulation. I think there would be a huge incentive for the government to be bringing rents down artificially everywhere to save money. And then that just makes it sort of like a nationalized thing, housing. And I don't want to like decide whether or not that's good or bad or could work, but it's very, very different. Whereas being a little less heavy handed with like who gets what and where would leave more room for a market to function the way we would hope a market would function.
Yeah, you really want competition to exist and you want to encourage it. Um, yeah, it's well-meaning. I understand just the concern that people have, and they think, oh, well, $1,300 per month does not pay for my rent in New York City. It needs to be higher, and I get that, but you've got to have that competition between between cheaper areas. You have to enable people to move. You like by getting rid of that. It's the same difference. Like people will ask about basic income about this kind of question, and they'll relate it directly, and they'll say, "Look at what we did with colleges. You give people loans for colleges, and they just keep raising the cost, and then we just give them more and more loans." And that's specifically for college. There's no competition there. You're saying we will give you any money you need for college, and you'll pay it back or whatever. But we have got to make sure that you get enough money for that.
Right.
But if you were to give them cash, then of course they could use it for anything, including college. In which case, colleges have to compete with other things, including like trade schools and everything else. And then you wouldn't see that.
It's sort of like begging for inflationary pressure. It's like,
Yeah.
It's sort of like leaning into the idea of like, won't landlords just gobble it all up by saying, we're just going to give landlords as much as it costs. It's like
you're eliminating the other market forces by like this targeting is like you're sort of like cutting off the other possible forces that might be like having an effect like in a nice kind of realistic way. So yeah, it's the artificial imposition of this sort of thing to pin it to pin the amount to is problematic. But it's it does like speak directly to like we want to make it easier to get a house in certain areas. Like it's obviously like we want to decrease homelessness. So it's like well-meaning, like you said, but sometimes that can have the wrong effect.
It feels like politically it's going to face huge headwinds, like, and rightly so.
Yeah, this is never going to happen.
Yeah,
but it's nice that people are
never
at least saying it should.
Well, it kind of like makes the Democrats look naive, which is true in this case. If you're proposing something like this, you're like not really thinking it through.
Yeah, that's the least of their problems.
I should add to another detail of this one is they would be only people between 18 and 65 years old. And I don't think I named the pilot of this. Is the Guaranteed Income Pilot Program Act of 2025 is the name of this. But yeah, so between 18 and 65 years old, then another detail of this is it's not going to everyone in a household. This is the same kind of typical thing where like even if it's going towards the amount of a 2-bedroom home, it's going to one person. So maybe a couple lives there, maybe a couple with a couple kids lives there. But that household of like 4 people would get the same amount as another household with one person because it's only going to like one person in that household. It's not actually
is it
a basic
saying
income.
That? Like the way I read this is that like 2 adults in a household could both get it,
No,
but then would they each get
so.
the full mark? Like they're just setting themselves up for so much bureaucracy here, and like determining how much a fair market rent is, and then who in the household gets it or can multiple. Like it's unnecessarily burdening yourself with all of this bureaucracy.
Yeah. I mean, I could go through the bill again to see, but I think it's just your typical guaranteed income, project. Like they're not learning. Those of us in the UBI space are trying to get people to understand that, no, really, like an important detail is that every member in a household needs to get this. But, they don't care. They're not listening. They're just like, no, we want to guarantee income. We want to just make sure, each household gets money. They don't understand like the importance of that seemingly small detail that each participant, each person in the household needs to get this.
I
And
sort
to
of
the fact that
suspect
it's
they're
under 65, they're like, you're ignoring Social Security recipients. They're saying, oh, we don't want to give money to people who have Social Security. And instead, it could be like boosting people on Social Security. And instead, you're going to be giving people who are under 65 more money, especially if they're living in an expensive place, than those seniors who are doing worse off, who need it too, but they're not counted.
I sort of suspect that they're not even really either they're not addressing the issue for themselves or they're just sleight of handing it, where they're not really recognizing that because it's 10,000 people out of 300 million people, what's really going to happen is they're going to only pick individuals in households and they're just going to like forget the others. So they're not really testing something universalist. They're not really testing something scalable. Because if you tried to turn this into a federal policy for everybody, then you would have to answer that question. It's like, then do we like determine how many people are in the household and only give it once? And then who do we give it to? They don't have to answer that question because they're just randomly picking 10,000 people from some certain areas or whatever. And it's sort of disingenuous or just like not aware that you're not really testing something that could become policy, which puts us back in this same sort of loop of like little demonstrations that don't really have anywhere to go. And we can learn a little, maybe like an elected gets some positive buzz, but it's not really backed with the potential to go somewhere until something better is tried out.
The next thing I wanted to cover, since it leads right into it, I feel what we're just been talking about. This is the results of another homeless basic income pilot. This was built off the Miracle Money pilot in San Francisco, where really like a small number of people got a basic income for it was less than a year. And they scaled it up and did more of an RCT kind of program, the randomized control group. And so here's the executive summary of this report. Launched in 2022, Miracle Money California is a program designed to provide relational and financial support to people experiencing homelessness. In response to promising results that emerged from a pilot study conducted by Miracle Messages, a nonprofit organization, Miracle Money California focused on scaling distribution to a greater number of people experiencing homelessness and building in time to learn about both the process and impact of direct cash transfers in this context. Conducted in partnership with researchers at the University of Southern California, the accompanying mixed method study is among the first randomized controlled trials of basic income in the U.S., specifically for people experiencing homelessness, and the first to explicitly test the role of relational resilience that has been shown to buffer stress and foster stability. The study was designed to better understand the impact of cash distribution plus social support to 103 participants living in either the San Francisco Bay Area or in Los Angeles County, who received $750 per month for 12 months. Between 2022 and 2024, nearly $1 million was distributed directly to these participants as part of the study. Well, close to half of all participants exited homelessness during the course of the study. Findings showed that monthly payments did not lead to statistically significant differences in homelessness visits or employment. However, qualitative interviews and reporting on how the funds were used revealed the utility of flexible cash as well as social support for providing essential needs and choice. Participants use funds to meet essential needs like food, housing, and transportation, challenging common myths that cash support is misused or undeserved. Stability and dignity, monthly payments were described as a blessing, helping people weather crises, regain a sense of control, and plan for what came next. And human connection. These findings highlight the strengths and limitations of cash transfers. While providing funding that cannot cover high housing costs will not necessarily reduce rates of homelessness, the flexibility of cash, when paired with relational supports that affirm dignity and agency, can restore a sense of control and connection. So, yeah, it was, I'm sure people look at this and say
Stay
that.
on that page. There's just one thing I want to point out in general for people, and it has to do with this difference between guaranteed income, direct cash transfer, and basic income. And it's just like a subtle flag to me. And I like the miracle messages people and what they're doing. Just like a psychological thing of emphasizing relational before financial. Programs are designed to provide relational and financial support. And that's an instinct that exists in a lot of places where people like, oh yeah, we'll give people cash, but also what they really need is other services and people and connection and community. And I agree that people can need all those things. But this instinct of relational first sort of couched in that is this idea that people need guidance even more than they need money. And that's one of the things we're trying to sort of strip away. Like this, what it really belies to me is sort of an urge to control to some degree always, which to me implies this idea that some people are inferior at some things or not as good at some things. And that has to be baked into the policy design. Like we need extra accommodations for people. And you can't have any version of any policy that doesn't wrap that in too, which I think is something that would be really well advised to separate. And that's what UBI does for me, where it's like UBI is just cash, period, because a lot of people can really handle what they need to handle if you just give them financial agency. And you don't need to presume that they also need like a phone buddy or like some like a rehab consultation or financial literacy classes. And this urge to sort of combine these always rather than making them separate. Like give people money first and then make these other things available, I think is detrimental and more elitist than people realize. And so that's something I always
Yeah, and
notice.
that's a pretty subtle difference. So, like, you think about like it depends kind of like who is in the Miracle Friend group. Like, is it like a bunch of like researchers and people that aren't really necessarily your peers and experiencing the same issues, but or is it a group of people that are kind of like your cohorts in the study?
Miracle Messages is a nonprofit, like located like in the Bay Area. What they did until recently was they focused only on the idea of like pairing homeless people with like a friend who is a volunteer. And so like you want to help the homeless, you go to Miracle Messages and you sign up as a volunteer to be someone's phone buddy. And so you're agreeing to be someone that they can text and call to just like help out. And then this nonprofit decided, well, let's just actually give people money too. And they found that that was far more impactful than what they were doing just with the messaging. And so, they're not saying that it's not effective at all, but and because that's like the whole nonprofit is built around this. Now they're also leaning into money too. And so they wanted to do this cash plus approach where you're giving people cash and you're doing the phone buddy thing. And so what this graph here shows is you've got, you've got your control group, which is 107 people, and you had the Miracle Money group, which I believe was, both the cash and the buddies, and then the Miracle Friend group, which was like only the buddies. Interestingly, it showed that. So here, our analysis indicates that people who received Miracle Money were 20% more likely to exit homelessness compared to the control group. But this difference was not statistically significant, which means we cannot conclude that the Cash Plus model reduced homelessness. Again, like the executive summary, there was no statistical difference between these groups, just like in the Denver pilot, where you did not see that statistical difference between those given cash and the control group, even though there was this 20% difference, it wasn't like large enough. And also, interestingly, it looks from this that the buddy system was actually less effective, but not statistically significant either than the control group. So, I wish there would have been
So in
more
part, it
people
was
because
too
then,
small of
it's more like
a
you're
study.
more able to draw statistical significance.
Yeah, if you saw these same stats play out over a much bigger group, then they'd be, I think, significant at that point.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If you
Yeah.
had
If these
thousands and
same numbers
thousands of
held up.
people, these
Yeah.
would count. To me, I mean, and I think Miracle Messages came by it honestly. They started with this idea of friends and companions and buddies and stuff, and that's a lovely idea, and I'm sure it helped people. And then they brought in the cash, and they're like, "Oh, this can help more." Like, I'm not trying to criticize. There is an element like when we set up our basic income program for the docu series, we were very cognizant of the ethics of keeping it from being sort of a pay to play situation where we didn't let the documentary project run the basic income. Like we found a partner foundation, Netroots Foundation, and said, will you guys run this basic income program? And your agreement with the people receiving it is that they're just going to get it, period. Like they're not supposed to send it to political campaigns or whatever, but it has nothing to do with whether or not they film with us. Whereas if you're in a thing where like one thing is coupled with another, sort of the implication is Like, even if you don't want to do weekly phone calls with an accountability buddy or whatever, you do it because you'll get some money also. And I think it becomes better science and better ethics when you completely separate the two and firewall them and make sure the money is different. And like, so for them, if they wanted to take this to the next level, like maybe split up or have the money handled by one and have the messages by another, where they have a partnership where if you're getting this cash, you also like, you could reach out and have one of these miracle messages buddies too, if you wanted it, rather than it being sort of all baked in together.
Yeah, I think this is another one, another study where it's like the study is kind of the thing that they're doing in addition. Like really it's people wanting to help other people and trying to find money to get to other people. And like the whole science part of it is like we will do the science part of it because we sort of can, but it's not the main focus, right? And it's not the main goal is to like prove the worth of this program. I think everybody that's involved in it knows that what they're doing is a good thing.
What was the size and the duration again of the basic income payment?
It was $750 per month for 12 months.
It's interesting to take an amount that's probably significantly less than the rent and have your main metric be a reduction in homelessness. I mean, I would still expect to see some for people that are on the edge, but it's like, I don't know. I would want to do it with more money.
And again, we covered this before. Another one, this was like the first RCT that compared housing vouchers to cash. And on average, that was around $800 per month. And we saw that the cash was like so much more effective. I think it was 3 or 4 times more effective than vouchers in getting people housed within, I think it was a year and a half. So this was actually prior to a year too. So you could say it's short. It's more interesting to do a longer study, but also I wouldn't say that $800, $750, whatever is not enough to reduce homelessness. It very well could have reduced it by 20% compared to the control group. It just wasn't enough people to show that significance.
I feel like if I'm designing this program, like if Bootstraps had been for specifically homeless people, I'm trying to game out like what are the additional costs of being homeless and then getting housed? And you got to save up, a month or two of rent for a deposit and first month's rent. And people who are homeless generally have little to no savings, and they have additional expenses for how they eat and how they feed themselves. Like it costs money to be poor. So I would want like to just sort of imagine myself in the situation of being homeless and being like, what would I need to efficiently get into a different situation where, you can overcome those transition hurdles. And that said, I wouldn't do just for homeless people. I would focus on like preventing people from getting homeless and stuff like that. But I would think if someone is already homeless, that's where I'd want to introduce more wraparound services as options. But comparing like an insufficient amount to get out of homelessness for most people to say a housing first program where you just put someone indoors and all of a sudden now they have an easy way to take a shower, easy way to like sleep well at night and stuff like that. I would think for that person in that situation, I would rather just be put indoors even if I don't have money, if it's not enough money,
I also don't know about per person impacts here either. Like it's just it's a failing across all of these pilots where they're just not understanding the importance of per person per household. So there's a lot of homeless people that in the study that I'm sure were just single adult individuals, in which case that's fine. But if there were, a couple and they're just like together getting 750 or one person is getting it, or like if someone has some kids and it's 750 just for the adult and not anything for the kids, it's just not as impactful as it would be. And it doesn't show any scaling. It's really important, I think, to do a pilot where you're saying, okay, we're going to look at how many people are in a household and we're going to make sure that scales. Because, that's just so much more effective at getting people housed when you can actually better afford that housing thanks to, each person getting something. Like one adult can be a roommate with someone else. So $800 can go a lot further for that person. But, if you've got some kind of family, you need a bigger place and you need multiple rooms and that's going to cost more. And 750 is going to do a lot less for you.
And that's a way to accomplish the sort of buddy system without having to put it in place, like assigning people friends or whatever, is if everyone's getting the basic income. Like if two people are unhoused and they're each getting $800 a month and they meet each other and they're like, hey, let's go in together. Now they can
Yeah.
afford a
Yeah.
$1,600 place and they can just do that of their own volition. They don't have to like go through someone who's been assigned to them. Right. So if the program would be like, oh, it's, I don't think they'd be able to like prevent people in miracle messages from doing that. So it could be two in a household. But if you have this sort of thing going on citywide or whatever, then any person can go up to anybody else and say, hey, you, me, and our two other buddies, let's all go in on a 4-bedroom, and that totally changes the dynamics of getting housed. Like that's basically how I lived in Manhattan for a long time with very low rent. Is like we crammed into an apartment we could fit into and split it, and having the ability to do that rather than having everyone supposedly try to live in a 2-bedroom studio or whatever, like the government has determined is like the way people should live. Like if I'm in my 20s, I'm living with all the dudes from my acting class and we're just kind of keeping as cheap as possible. And that should be fine to do. And if we each have a basic income, it's easy to pull that off.
Yeah. But I just want to get to a little more of this data before we move on to the next one. So yeah, it's been on the screen. The employment impacts, I'm sure plenty of people are curious, did they work less? Did they work more or whatever? And, lo and behold, same as usual, it didn't really see any impact there. And same thing, oh, they're going to use it on drugs. And guess what? That didn't happen. And, it's funny, like these charts, these are always the least interesting to me of like everything. Like I just don't care about how people spend their money. I guess just because I trust them to the point where I don't care. And also I know that, like just because you get this money and you're gonna, you can always use other money for your alcohol and drugs and stuff, and so you're not going to use like this money for it when you can use other money. But anyways, it's just 1% used in alcohol, 0.7% on drugs, and then most of it, is housing, food, and transportation. Like this is the same pie chart I see over and over again. It's so uninteresting to me to even gather this data.
Mm-hmm.
I do not care. But for people who just worry about, it'll be wasted or whatever, this is just, you're covering basic needs. It's just whatever you're covering.
Right.
You need to eat, you need housing, you need transportation, you need healthcare.
Well,
there's
also a counterintuitive thing that like this sort of chart belies, where people think like if we just give people the basic necessities, then they'll spend basic necessities amount of money, then they'll spend it on basic necessities, and they won't spend it on alcohol or drugs. But if we gave people more, maybe they would like spend more on alcohol and drugs once their rent is covered. And I actually think it's the opposite, where the more you're still struggling, the more you use coping mechanisms. And the bigger the basic income, not only is the amount you spend on alcohol and drugs less as an absolute number because you have less of a desire to escape your life for most people, but also it's a relatively percentage-wise smaller amount too. So like I think in this case, where people would imagine an increasing size of basic income would go more and more to drugs and alcohol, I think it would go less and less, both absolutely and on a percentage basis.
What bothers me about this is that, is as you go up in income, it becomes like more and more okay to spend like a lot of money on like alcohol and stuff. Like if you go to a fine restaurant, the biggest portion of your bill is going to be on wine. It's not going to be on like the steak and stuff, when like a bill is $10,000, it's because you bought like a 9,000 bottle of wine and you're bragging about it. You're saying like, oh, I bought a $9,000 bottle of wine for the table. I'm so rich and I'm so important, enjoy your wine. And so it's so weird to me that it's like, it's a positive thing and you're like bragging about it. But then if you're poor,
if you showed that same pie chart to
ashamed.
somebody who's like got a high income, you'd be like, God, that person's disgusting. Like they've wasted
Right,
all
and
their
it'd be like,
money
no,
on
it's the
alcohol
finest
and
scotch.
drugs. Yeah.
Person is probably still spending far less than 1% of their income on it.
Unless they're a huge fan, but it's still okay. Like if you have an income of $200,000 a year, you're upper class, upper middle class, whatever. And if you spend 10% of that on bourbon each year or something. You just call yourself a fan. I'm like, I'm a bourbon snob. Yeah, I spend 10% of my income on bourbon, but it's really good stuff. Like, I'm not drinking the cheap stuff by the bottle. I'm just drinking a nice glass of super expensive bourbon, once every day or once every other day or whatever, and that's like totally fine to spend a lot of money on like fine alcohol. But no, if you're poor, you can't do that. That's terrible.
That's the thing that's keeping you poor.
Right.
I remember, I don't know, this kind of reminds me of like someone came up to me in New York City when I was like very low income, struggling, working at restaurants, trying to put all of my money towards paying my rent and like maybe trying a little project here and there. And somebody came up to me from some organization like food bank or something, I don't know, or environmental, doesn't matter. The basic approach was assuming like I looked like I was more privileged or whatever, or had more income than I was, like, how much money do you spend on food every day? And they were basically going to make the case that I should spend $10 less and put that towards their charity a day or something like that. And I was like thinking, well, I get my lunch and my dinner at the restaurant, and then I eat like an apple for breakfast. So like $1? He's like, so if you put 10% of that toward, and I'm like, maybe I'm not your target demographic, and it's like, this is something important about basic income is like, if you decide that we need to give everyone universal basic services, so we're going to give everyone food and everyone gets like a certain amount of food. Someone like me in that situation doesn't need food. I got it covered. It comes through my job. But I need a lot of other things. And then this is a situation where if it was cash, I could use it towards those other things like education or starting projects or whatever. And if you just stop trying to determine what I get and what I need, then you spend a lot less money trying to get me just the cash, and I make a much bigger impact on my own life with it.
Okay. I was going to go to a different pilot for more results, but now that you just started talking about that, I want to go to this conversation, which is about like universal basic services versus universal basic income. I'm told, I actually haven't watched this yet. I also just know that Richard Murphy has been talking more about like universal services versus universal basic income recently. And it's like, it's annoying to me personally.
So we can get your live reaction.
I think, yeah, you're getting my live reaction. But I also, I already know in general what Richard Murphy has been saying. And I like Richard Murphy. Like, he's done great stuff. He really understands modern monetary theory, even from like a pro UBI perspective. Like, he's not like your typical, oh, you've got to do job guarantee for this to work, UBI is bad or whatever. Instead, he's more like just leaning towards services and that, the importance is, the question to ask is not how can we afford it. He's not asking that question, which is great. And then for those who don't know, Zack Polanski, he's Green Party in the UK, recently became the new leader of that party. And he's been talking about UBI for years. And so I was really excited to see him actually take over as the new leader of the party. And the party has had like a massive jump in numbers too, since he took over leadership. Like, they actually just passed the Conservative Party in number of supporters recently. So I would like to watch this whole conversation, but
how long is it?
Just these last few minutes is them talking about this. And as you can see, like, they've been agreeing about a lot of stuff the whole time. And then Zach wants to end this with talking about like UBI. So here's
and just to end on a disagreement, because we're at risk of agreeing too much. So I was at Modern Money Lab in Bristol recently with the amazing Sheridan Tate and Patricia Nino, like just brilliant economists. And I felt like the audience was really with me. I can read a room up until the point where I mentioned the words universal basic income. And I felt a sharp intake of breath.
Yes.
What's going on with UBI in light of MMT?
Look, MMT, let me be clear, I'm not a spokesperson for everything to do with MMT, and I don't agree with quite a lot of people in MMT, and quite a lot of them don't agree with me.
Great.
There's a chap called Bill Mitchell, one of the founders of it, who does not agree with Stephanie Kelton and doesn't agree with me. Let's be clear, he actually doesn't agree with Stephanie as well. Now, there is a problem with UBI in MMT because they prefer something called a job guarantee, which they say is the automatic balancer instead of the interest rate within the economy. I actually think that's a little naive. So I don't agree with most people in MMT on this, because that requires the government to have a pool of jobs available at any moment to offer somebody at the drop of a hat if they become unemployed. And I don't know.
It feels very authoritarian as well.
Well, I don't like that aspect of it either. There are quite a lot of aspects of the job guarantee I'm not that keen on, including the fact we can force you into work, and sometimes you don't want to force people into work. So I don't think that's core to MMT. Okay. I think that's a policy consequence that some have chosen to tack on to MMT. I differentiate the two.
So we don't agree. Don't disagree. I just didn't know that was your position.
But actually, I'm also not completely convinced about UBI either. I did some work a decade ago now with a chap called Howard Reed, who's a great economist, who's now at the University of Northumbria, and we modelled UBI. And the trouble was that to make it work, you're pumping a lot of money out to everybody. We modelled giving people, at that time, 16,000 quid a year per person, plus half that for children. So we were talking about a serious portion of median wage at the time being paid out as a universal basic income to guarantee that you could survive. The difficulty was that required income tax rates, which were into the 80% at income of around £70,000 a year. And that would encourage tax abuse. I have actually debated with Arthur Laffer. Most people in the world can't say that. I've done that, and a vote was taken, and I beat him hands down.
The famous Laffer curve.
The famous Laffer curve. This is the guy who says that high rates of tax are a disincentive. I have met Arthur. He talks nonsense, but at that rate, you would have a problem. I personally think that UBI would create such distortions in the tax system, not just domestically, but internationally, it would be quite difficult. I'm not therefore convinced by it. But I am convinced by universal basic services. I do think that we must guarantee rights of access to a lot of things which people at the moment don't have. Apart from healthcare, apart from education. And education is not a right anymore. It's paid for, and it's very expensive for many people. And even transport to education is not guaranteed.
Can we not do both? Can we not have universal basic services and give people money that they're free to spend on?
I don't think so at the moment. I think you would actually create too much economic disruption for the economy to manage. And I would love to be a revolutionary. I think it's very romantic, but I'm not, because also deep down inside, there's these words accountant inside me. I was a chartered accountant in practice for over 40 years. I'm not a revolutionary, and I think that would be pushing people too far, too quickly, for them to be able to manage the consequences. You would create a state of too much flux, disruption and uncertainty that the economy would suffer.
I wonder if we could get the balance right.
Right, so we're back to this same point. Grab your low-hanging fruits, take people on a journey with you. You talk about narratives, I talk about narratives as well. A lot of the time I think I'm creating narratives. On universal basic income, you've got to start with universal basic services and walk people through that. Just as with, I would say, let's have a wealth tax when we've done all the easy bits of tackling inequality through existing taxes. And then if we still need to do a wealth tax, let's do universal basic services. Let's people get used to all of this, see the benefits. Then you begin to look at whether you want UBI. But don't go for UBI first. It's not the headline.
Just want to say, I've never met someone who can speak at a faster speed than I can. I've loved this conversation.
Okay. So yeah, it's pretty much what
He's so polite. Calling him a blabbermouth. Wow, you're so good at talking fast. I noticed a few things. One is that the 16,000 quid a year plus half that for kids is a very large.
And he said that was 10 years ago too.
Yeah.
So I don't think that he was like adjusting for the time. I think it was 16,000 10 years ago.
That's a huge basic income. It seems like he's presuming it's entirely income tax funded, as opposed to like having some of it be sort of paid for by savings across society. So there's that. So it seems like he's assuming something enormous, which I think would have...
I agree. I think it was too large.
Very transformative impacts on the economy, even to the extent where it's like, I wouldn't want to start that big, even if that's where we end up, because I want to kind of like see the labor market reactions and like build to it, right? I don't want to just jump into the, everyone should be able to afford a two-bedroom studio individually. And like, I don't know what that does that fast. But the other thing is when he's like, I'm all for universal basic services, I would just ask him like, okay, name a service and go through the list of like, well, if you want to make sure everyone gets food, what's cheaper? Shipping somebody food or digitally sending them enough cash to get that food, right? And if it's cheaper to do the cash, then that is a service you do with cash, period. If he's worried about the cost, it's like, what about the cost of the service? Like you're trying to have people control how to get people all sorts of stuff. We already have a marketplace and an infrastructure that does all that fine if there's people who have money to like go spend it.
Yeah. I think if you're talking about universal basic services, cash should always be considered one of those services. And if you really want to make sure and separate those, then you're like, okay, well, we need UBI too. But if you're talking about UBS, then yeah, cash has to be part of it. And as you said, food as a service does not make sense. The market does a great job with that. And he mentioned healthcare. They're in the UK, so they already have the NHS, which is the biggest thing, that we don't have. So when we're talking about universal basic services here in the US as being in addition to universal basic income, I'm really just thinking universal healthcare for sure. And then stuff like pre-K through college in regards to education as another major service. And then, maybe childcare as is like an additional thing, even though, a high enough basic income that includes kids could do a lot for the childcare component. But we should at least focus a little bit on childcare. But like beyond those things, I'm not thinking of like other like super important services. Like, are you, when you're thinking about like housing, I guess is another one, but
housing depends on the level of regulation going
about
on.
That. Right.
For me, the only one that is
the amount of UBI.
The only one that is far and away has to be a service, not cash, is healthcare, because healthcare is the most inelastic of needs. You can take your business elsewhere for whatever other things you want, especially if there's a competitive market in housing. But healthcare, they can just say it's infinity $1 million and you'll just like, I guess I'll try to pay before I die. Like you can't not get healthcare. It has to be a service. You can't give people cash because they'll have to sign on the line no matter how much they're charged, which is why we get charged 100 times what other countries do for the same stuff.
The thing I would add as well is that with Richard talking about 16,000 per adult, 8,000 per kid, and the tax rates required, you're not differentiating marginal tax rates versus effective tax rates with that kind of thing. And so a $16,000 per year basic income for what's that be? 2 adults be 32,000. Let's just do that. So that's $32,000 effectively a tax credit for that couple. So if you raise that couple's tax rate, so like let's say they're paying 50%, or let's go higher than that. Say, oh, you have to raise it to 80%. Like I think he said something really high. That's the marginal tax rate. It's like the bracket tax rate. I don't know the brackets either in the UK, but like that's the top tax rate that you would pay or whatever. But you're not counting the basic income as a tax credit. So like that couple isn't actually paying, 80% of their income in taxes. They're effectively paying potentially 20% of their income in taxes or something after counting the basic income as a giant tax credit. Like the question I was asked Richard Murphy too is, would you support a negative income tax of an equivalent design with a phase out rate of say, 20% or something? Because clearly that costs a lot less just from the price tag level, because you're no longer worrying about taxes as part of this. And if you do that, then the requirements for your taxes that you have to raise go down a lot more, because you're no longer, because like the negative income taxes, including like a phase out tax, is part of it. It's just it looks cheaper, even though like it really isn't, just because Richard isn't, I think, counting the basic income as like this giant negative tax. So that's what adds to the confusion too, where like I just disagree. I've been working this out recently about like what would it cost to do a 20% GDP per capita UBI in the US, which would be about $17,000 per adult. And then you would have a child component of a third of that. And it's just not super expensive, especially if you then look at the like marginal tax rates versus effective tax rates. Like it's just, and I also just for fun included universal healthcare into the cost too. So like a large basic income and a full universal healthcare plan can be very affordable. It's just because inequality is so massive. I know the UK has bad inequality too. I don't think as bad as ours. So maybe it's, maybe it's just going to have a little bit lower there. Yeah, I think that's the main thing is they need to go a little bit lower to start.
With the UBI calculator that I did, a couple of people like Max Ganis, he proposed one that was pretty radical. It was like everyone's paying 60% income taxes and we fund UBI and healthcare or something like that. Politically speaking, based on what we get for our money now, that's like really hard for people to wrap their heads around. And they're not really connecting to this idea. And I think he included for kids too. But like this program, for example, in the UK, even say you are funding the entire thing with 80% income taxes on every dollar everyone earns, you still have a world where everyone is at like the median income to start with, like the current median income. Everyone has that permanently. Everyone has education and healthcare. So the reason you're making money is not to survive. It's for like extras. It's for gravy. It's for whatever. And like, so now all of a sudden being taxed at a high rate when you're having your survival dollars taxed really hurts, but being taxed at a high rate when it's your disposable income hurts far, far less. You know you're okay. Your kids are always going to be okay. You're going to be okay in retirement. And so now it's more of like a game of like, okay, how much more can I do and make and improve my life knowing that I'm okay and I'm always going to be okay and my kids are always going to be okay. It just changes your entire quality of life. And so it still might be worth it if it's like, I wouldn't do it this way, but like 80% taxes.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's funny too. If you're thinking about 80% taxes, then, there is that person. Let's say it's an 80% flat tax, which is insane. That's not going to be that high. We don't need to be that high. That's more of like a top bracket rate. But let's just assume, 80% across the board. And, there's someone who's paying 80% of their income to get exactly the same amount back in basic income, in which case it's the same thing as taxing them zero. So what is that person complaining about? Because they're effectively not paying any taxes and they're ostensibly paying 80%, but they're also not, they're paying zero. So that's the thing with like comparing, the basic income as a tax credit versus your taxes. Right. Like you can't ignore that interaction.
Yeah. And if you're factoring in the healthcare and you picture like, okay, here's somebody making like $1,500 a month, but they for some reason signed up for like a $700 a month premium on their healthcare plan, right? If they suddenly so now they're basically at a 50% tax rate, right? So if they then suddenly have that paid for, and that's now covered through their taxes, like they break even, right? Like even if they're at a 50% tax rate.
Yeah, I don't think we can wrap our
And that's
heads
not an
around.
unrealistic scenario. Like for a while, like I was paying more in health insurance than I was making a month on months where I like just didn't have money coming in.
Yeah, I don't think we're equipped yet to, and this is why we need to try to show it and build it. I don't think we're equipped to wrap our heads around what it looks like to know you're okay. Like we just don't have that mindset. So we have to think through this mindset of like, if A, B, and C and D don't keep happening, I'm not okay, right? That's totally different world. And the thing that an example like this high basic income or pretty high basic income, 16,000 quid in 2015 does is it does really bring focus to the deeper question that I think we would get to if we kept talking to that guy, Richard, which is the suspicion that people would withdraw from the labor market because of too high of a marginal tax rate and the ability to live comfortably without working. And that is a very interesting question. And it's one of the reasons I wouldn't start the tax rate so high or like fully fund the whole thing just to find out. Like, what do people really want? How much do people really want to work? That's the main question we have to ask ourselves is like, what drives people? In a world where there's a lot of very undesirable jobs that currently haven't been automated, that might be a big shift right there. Like, if you have an 80% marginal tax rate beyond your $32,000 a year, then maybe you're just like, fuck no, I'm not cleaning toilets or whatever because you'd have to pay me way too much for me to do something like that. And maybe that's fine, but we'd have to race to get that job automated or people would have to just, do it themselves. It would be a very dramatic shift from what we know right now. And I think we need to get there more.
I mean, I don't, what we know right now is not anything stable, right? Like it's like having this like sudden change in our, their tax rate is going to like totally destabilize everything. Like how much less stable can we get at this point? Like, I don't really see it. Like maybe for that like little sliver of people that are living comfortably with total certainty about their livelihood. But like most people are not in that little window from what I can.
Yeah. I would want to not swap one instability for another, potentially. I would want to say, like, here's something more stable, and if it's proving itself stable, let's keep growing that idea, and let's get people there,
Yeah.
One
feeling
other
good the whole
thing
time.
before we move on away from the basic services conversation, I also just want to mention too, because I don't think we covered it yet, just that you would spend so much less on national healthcare service. And we did talk about that like in previous weeks, but just to emphasize that again, like they're having a UK conversation about UBI versus services. They already have healthcare. And if you want to actually spend less on healthcare, then you would spend more on basic income. Like that's actually avoid that. And then when it comes to educational services, basic income would mean that money goes so much further. If you're a kid who's hungry in school, you can't focus. So congratulations on having a public school system that's using tax dollars to pay for school, but people are going through and getting C's and D's or whatever. Whereas if they had a basic income, they could focus and they could exit school with like A's and B's or something. Like you're going to see a difference in education. You're going to see a difference in health. You're going to see a difference in crime. All these services, they make less sense to do, I think, first. Like you want to make sure that people actually have their basic needs met first. And then, that can actually help determine these other services and it makes those services work better. So I think that's like not properly in that conversation that should be. It just makes
A good
so
way
much
to
more
frame
efficient.
it is like, do you want to provide basic services to people who are financially stable, or do you want to provide them to people who are financially
Right.
unstable? Right? Like it's kind of clear like which one's going to cost less to you.
Right. It sort of illuminates like an assumption going on that a lot of economists share, which is that like people are who they are, period. And past performance predicts future performance. Like this person is a, utility maximizer, bad spender, poor student, whatever. And now we need to try to fill in the gaps that they inherently have rather than seeing what gaps would be there if they just had a little more power. And so it's like just missing human behavioral psychology. Once again, as always, like how much would we actually save if we empowered people and just not understanding that that's part of it.
I just did a quick check using ChatGPT to determine, £16,000 10 years ago. What is that equivalent to in US dollars in today's dollars? And it's $33,000. So $1,000 UBI with half of that going to kids, like that is an insanely high UBI. Like I'm actually shocked looking at that number. If that's what he did, I hope he's adjusting for inflation and not like he actually did that number back then. But if he did that number back then, like I feel he's part of that camp that thinks UBI has to be super, super high.
Even now, that would be high. Even if he didn't adjust
super
it.
high.
Like, you start a family or a couple at 32,000 or an individual at 16,000 or like a family of 4 at 1,000, right? That's like median income level. It's like saying, it's not saying we start you at the poverty line. It's like, for the family of 4, we start you at the median.
Yeah, I mean the poverty level right now in the U.S. for one person is
It's like 13,000.
15,560. So it's almost $16,000 here in the U.S.
Right. That's for
Adjusting
an
till next
individual.
year, it'll be over that. For an individual, yeah.
The way they do the poverty line is if you have multiple people in a household, then they don't add the full amount for each person.
Right. But, that's also why, like, I think that a good amount to start at here in the US, if we're talking poverty eliminating basic income, it would be around $16,000 per adult, so it would be $32,000 per household with 2 adults, and then I wouldn't do half per kids, but that's another calculation to do.
Yeah, I would do
But anyways, like $33,000 per adult, that's an insane number. And I know people will say, oh, well, that's a minimum. Like you can't get by with less than $33,000 a year. Like, again, you're not understanding UBI if you're not seeing it as this floor. You should be thinking in terms of like poverty, like making sure we eliminate that. And $33,000, way more than that.
I wanted to ask real quick, like we have some people in the chat who aren't on YouTube, and I don't know what's coming in. There's Hippo the Prophet saying some interesting things. Then there's some spammer rippling complaint, something. But is there somewhere else? Maybe Hippo, you can say in the chat where you're commenting from. He says direct inflation-funded UBI sidesteps the whole issue of raising taxes and redistribution.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just do a UBI without any taxes and then raise the amount of UBI by the amount of inflation every year. Like, no, that is like actually hyperinflationary. Like, you do have to use taxes of some kind. They don't have to be one for one. Like it is wrong to say, okay, we're going to do, $2 trillion worth of UBI, so we have to do $2 trillion worth of taxes. Like, you don't need to do that. But you do need to actually pull money out of circulation each time you actually distribute more money. Like, that's just how you balance this stuff. But it doesn't need to be as high as people think it is. It doesn't need to, you don't need to tax income super high. You can tax a low amount. You can do transactions. You can tax, you can do a carbon tax. You can do non-tax ways actually of regulating the money supply, which would be like banking regulations. Like, there's a lot of ways of going about this that you don't need to do $1 per hour, and it's not as expensive as people think it is. But I would never say just do full-on inflationary UBI.
If you don't tax it back from the people who don't need it, then you're not getting another big benefit of UBI, which is reducing inequality.
Okay, so this is the Baltimore Young Family Success Fund. This provided, 30 young parents between the ages of 18 to 24 years old. They got $1,000 per month for 2 years. Okay, so key takeaways. Financial stability. Participants were able to boost their financial well-being by paying off debt and increasing their savings, and these improvements lasted after payments ended. 24 months into the program, participants had more stable household finances, and there was a statistically significant difference in debt, with 46% fewer participants reporting having credit card debt compared to the control group. There was also a significantly higher percentage of participants who had $500 or more in savings, at 12% compared to 1% of control group members. In regards to employment, participants were more likely to report doing either paid or unpaid work than control group participants, and a higher percentage of participants had income from employment compared to the control group. These trends continued after payments stopped, with 67% of household income coming from employment compared to 54% of control group household income. Increased access to childcare may have contributed to fewer issues at work. At 24 months, participants said they missed an average of 9 fewer hours of work in the past month compared to control group members, and were 50% less likely than control group members to say they missed so much work they were reprimanded. Using guaranteed income for childcare also allowed some interviewees to return to or attend school. Participants were more than twice as likely as control group members to say they had applied or were planning to apply for educational professional training. By the end of the pilot, the percentage of participants who were in school full or part-time had increased to more than 20%, with another 26% in the process of applying. Participants were also more likely to report being employed in work they found meaningful at 24 months and 30 months compared to control group members. At the 24-month survey, 39% more working participants said their job made a meaningful contribution to the world relative to the control group. See, food security, about half of the interviewees used the money to buy food, and the rate of food insecurity was significantly lower among participants compared to the control group. At 18 months, participants were 16 percentage points less likely to be food insecure, and this difference persisted even after payments stopped. At 30 months, participants were 20 percentage points less likely than control group members to be experiencing food insecurity. When it came to housing, it helped about half of interviewed participants pay rent, and some reported using guaranteed income to pay for security deposits or the cost of moving. The percentage of participants living with a friend or relative dropped from 37% at baseline to 23% at 24 months and 19% after payments stopped. This coincided with an increase in those reporting renting from 54% at baseline to 69% at 24 months. At 18 and 24 months, participants reported less household chaos on average compared to the control group, indicating guaranteed income may have helped families create more organized and peaceful home environments. When it came
Which
to
is huge in a
parenting,
lot of ways.
yeah,
That seems like a hand wavy thing, but like school outcomes, all kinds of stuff.
nearly all participants reported that guaranteed income helped them provide for their children's basic needs or engage their children in more enrichment activities. Interviews, participants reported that being able to provide for their children's physical needs, from diapers and formula to healthcare expenses, alleviated stress, and made them feel more satisfied and capable as parents. And then finally, when it comes to mental health, interviews indicate that guaranteed income helped reduce financial related stress. Participants reported lower rates of stress than the control group at 24 months, and the impact may have lasted beyond the pilot, with participants reporting significantly lower scores on the Kessler scale at 30 months. And finally, participants were also 15 percentage points more likely to say they felt they mattered more to people around them.
What's
That's
the
an especially big one, I think. It's just a way of measuring mental health.
Interesting. Something about the way, just the parameters of this made me think, like duration is really important, not just size. And this was a 2-year program. When we set up ours, we wanted to do at least 2 years just because sort of had this idea that like, okay, year 1, what happens when you're sort of underwater? You stop the bleeding. Maybe year 2, you start making some moves. And beyond that, like eventually you start building wealth. Like, and the smaller the basic income, the longer those phases take, right? And I was just kind of thinking about how this would play out in terms of if UBI were federal policy for everybody, where it's like we have this transitionary generation where it's going to take a while and different amounts of time, depending on the size of the basic income and people's situations, for people to like build out of the trauma, like to like stop the bleeding in their lives. Everyone's going to have a different version of that. And then once the bleeding is stopped, then you're like, okay, I'm fine now. Now I can make some moves. And then you have like a lot of people across society trying to do this more and more. And when you're making moves and when you're fine, you start socking a little bit away and you start building wealth. And those are the steps, right? You stop the bleeding, make some moves, build some wealth. And when you make those moves, you know you're never going to fall into like total bloody territory. You're going to be able to recover. So that's generation 1. And then generation 2 to me is different. Like if your parents had this and they've already stopped the bleeding, maybe they're already making moves or they built some wealth, then you start off your life, you know, with a little bit of wealth, never bleeding. And like you start off your life with an entirely different view of like how you go about living that life, what you pursue, because it's all about like what moves do I want to make? What do I want to do? And so we have this difference between generations of like your mentality of what your whole purpose on this earth is for and what opportunities are available to you. And so like these 1-year pilots or 9-month pilots or 1.5, like it'd be interesting to see a study of like the differences in terms of people's outlook and strategy and what they've achieved before it ends versus like a 5-year or a 10-year sort of a thing. We definitely noticed sort of trend lines for how long we were in the basic, like with the Bootstraps pilot and docuseries, like the scenes in the first 6 months of people's basic income are different than the scenes in the last 6 months of people's basic incomes. People have sort of like built themselves to a different status. And I did notice that the people that were the furthest behind spent a lot more of their time kind of stopping the bleeding, and the people who were the furthest ahead were just sort of like building on their opportunities and their wealth and investments and pursuits, you know. So there is sort of like over time what you use the basic income for changes, and what society uses the basic income for changes, because right now our whole society needs to stop the bleeding. And how long does that take? That really depends on how big it is.
Yeah. It was interesting in this study how it was one of the few, like not a lot of them had to have done $1,000 per month. This was one of them. And this was a 2-year pilot, versus 1 year. So that already, like a lot of them had been 1 year and a lot of them had been $5 per month. When it goes to 2 years and more and $1,000 or more, there's a lot fewer pilots. And it's interesting to see that this is also had some of like the most successful I've seen too. Like a lot of good stuff came out of this pilot.
Yeah,
So
well,
encouraging.
it's catching new parents, right? Like that's who it's
Young
directed
parents
to.
in particular, yeah.
Yeah, which is like that's sort of where you're feeling this like sudden economic hit where it's basically you've got new bleeding that needs to be stopped. That's so like in a way you're sort of saying like the basic income's going to the child because what's a child going to do with it besides let their parents spend it on them, right? So it's kind of like it's creating a new form of stability for that family. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'm getting ready to go here, but we're seeing all these studies that are just like, oh, look how basic income helps this subgroup of people. Look how it helps new parents. Look how it helps, artists. Look how it helps like each of these like segments of society. And like, when do we cover it? At a certain point, it's going to be everyone, right? Like we're going to have a study to cover every single possible lifestyle, if we keep going at this rate. But like, when are we going to do the study that sees whether it has an impact on the ultra rich? right? Like, what if we start giving $1,000 a month to the ultra rich, like
Well,
we're doing?
that has to be.
And
what if we reduce the incomes of the ultra rich? How do they fare?
right, yeah. See, like when we start to see the needle move, like how much do we have to remove from the income before we start to see like a negative effect? I
Well,
think it'll
I
take
mean,
quite a while.
you have to understand that we're potentially creating an economy where their businesses can continue to flourish and not fold under the lack of consumers. So
Right, yeah.
I don't think you can really do that study until you have a full basic income. Like that's one of the more speculative, like what does it mean to rich people to live in a world of basic income? It goes well beyond like losing some more of your money to taxes. Yeah. I think one thought that just occurred to me that I wanted to express just for anyone listening is you shouldn't think of universal basic income as one program. We've got 340 million people in the country, and cash can be used on anything. Universal basic income is 340 million programs, and it's easier to administer those 340 million programs than it is to administer one program that's trying to target something.
Right. It's 340 million programs with a practically 0% overhead. Yeah. Which is unheard of.
The programs administer themselves because all they needed was some fuel.
Yeah. And all you have to do is trust them. It's the distrust that costs so much. Gosh, it's sad to see you go early again. We got more to cover, so I can't just like end the show. So we're gonna have to go on a bit more.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, yeah, sorry. I will be leaving you guys. Have some fun, and I will catch whatever you've recorded on the recording.
If it makes you feel better, the show's always worse when you're gone. Like we're just straggling to the end.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sure you'll get there at some point, or maybe I'll just catch you in 3 weeks and you'll still be talking. Okay.
See you, Josh. All right. So I wanted to make sure. Actually, let's cover this news first. I think this is pretty interesting. Okay, so this is out of Hamburg, Germany, and so this was it's a city in Germany, and they had their own referendum. So it was like the Swiss referendum, but instead of implementing a basic income, it would have implemented a basic income pilot in Hamburg, Germany, and they voted no. So it turned out 62.6% of citizens voted against it, 37.4% voted for it, and the voter turnout was 43%. What it would have done was launch a pilot for 2,000 people, and they would have received 1,346 euros per month to 2,000 people would have been the pilot. And yeah, they voted against it. One of the reasons they voted against it was actually because some people felt there already been like plenty of pilots elsewhere, which I think is totally valid. But other people just didn't want to do it. So just kind of discouraging. I would have preferred a much closer. I would have preferred it passed, but I would have preferred it to be much closer. It just seems like more than 37.4% of voters should have been interested in at least testing it out. And they said no.
Right. But I feel like too, I'm just curious if there was a survey for like what all people's reasons were. But like when I'm hear about like another pilot that's like 1,000 people that are going to get some little amount for a year, I'm like, but why? I think at a certain point it just sort of muddies the thing. We're sort of like punting the actual doing of the next steps by doing the same step over again for the 200th time.
Yeah. I mean, I totally appreciate we don't need to test this anymore and let's just do it. But I don't get the impression that Hamburg would have voted yes to just doing it, which is unfortunate because, I don't know, here's some of the more stuff about like why. Apart from the left, all parliamentary groups were against the basic income. The SPD and the Greens considered the model to be too expensive. It did not provide any scientific added value because there had already been model tests elsewhere. In addition, the basic income is not unconditional at all because income is taken into account. For the CDU, the referendum put to the vote a costly, immature project that raises more questions and it answers. But yeah, there was a vote and they said no.
Silly hamburgers. It actually reminds me, just has nothing to do with UBI, but I was at a cemetery in upstate New York, and near Chester A. Arthur's grave in Albany was a grave of someone named Sadie Hamburgers. And I found that very charming. I use that as like an epithet sometimes, or it's like if you're, Sadie Hamburgers.
R.I.P. hamburgers.
Yeah, people can take that and try to make it a thing. Sadie Hamburgers.
So here's a video that I wanted to watch. This was another like GiveDirectly related video talking about recent stuff that they learned. I actually haven't watched this either because I wanted to save it till our watching it together. But I think it goes over, the results from modeling. But yeah, here it is.
In 2018, a nonprofit gave every adult in Western Kenya's Ahenyo village $500. Most of their families had lived in extreme poverty for generations, and this sum was roughly equivalent to most recipients' annual salaries. Despite all this, the money came with no strings attached outside a commitment to speak with researchers after 2 years. They hoped this influx of cash would lift the villagers out of poverty, but they also knew this could easily be the latest in a long line of failed philanthropic interventions. In the 1960s, charitable organizations began ramping up their philanthropic efforts, spending billions funding education, job training, agricultural development, infrastructure projects, and healthcare programs in attempts to help poor countries. These programs hoped to create a springboard of knowledge and capital that would foster financial independence and bolster struggling economies. But when economists started studying this kind of aid in the late 90s and early 2000s, they made some surprising discoveries. After running various randomized control trials where one group received education or job training and another group did not, the researchers found this kind of aid often had minimal impact. School supplies failed to improve education, job training didn't always raise incomes, and the benefits of nutrition education varied dramatically from group to group. These disappointing results even extended to newer philanthropic models. At this time, many theorists advocated heavily for microfinance, a model that offered small loans to aspiring entrepreneurs in weak economies. But while microfinance recipients consistently repaid their loans with interest, the programs failed to meaningfully raise their incomes. All these failures led researchers to consider a strategy many considered ridiculous: direct cash giving. Most philanthropists saw this approach as the worst kind of short-sighted philanthropy. They assumed recipients would quickly spend the cash and then end up back where they started. But when researchers returned to Ahenyo 2 years later, the results were astonishing. Business revenues were up 65%. Families saved more and ate more. Kids were doing better in school. There was less alcoholism, depression, domestic violence, and inequality between families. And these impacts weren't unique to Ahenyo. Since this study, direct cash giving has become one of the most researched poverty interventions, and it's consistently shown impacts that often exceed traditional aid programs. In fact, a subsequent study spanning hundreds of Kenyan villages found the surrounding economy grew by more than twice what was given out just a year after the cash transfers. However, direct cash giving isn't a silver bullet. Poverty is a generational issue that requires long-term changes to solve. And since this intervention is relatively new, we still don't fully understand the effects of cash giving on extended timelines. For example, a Ugandan study beginning in 2008 found that while a cash transfer improved some families' earnings over the first 4 years, the positive effect disappeared after the next 5 years. Then it returned again under the pressure of the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, we still have a lot to learn about how cash giving unfolds over time. But regardless of what we learn in the future, The theory for why direct cash giving works can help change how we think about poverty today. Where traditional aid programs assume that philanthropists have the best knowledge of a community's needs, cash giving programs believe the people experiencing poverty best understand what they need to escape it. For example, perhaps for one person, repairing their home is more important to long-term success than starting a new business. And for another, ensuring their child can finish school might allow them to bring in more money in the future. Fortunately, we can afford this kind of help. Today, wealthy countries spend $200 billion a year in international aid, and philanthropists have $1.5 trillion more sitting in private foundations. We already have the means to eliminate extreme poverty, but doing so will require these institutions to trust the expertise of the people actually living in these conditions. So, how can we design programs that actually help lift people out of generational poverty?
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty good background of like the GiveDirectly story. I want to say really quick that I figured out why I wasn't seeing everything. I put it on live chat. I guess Hippo, they thought you were spam or something. But you've been saying good stuff, so keep it up. One thing I want to point out about that presentation is that it is from a mindset of philanthropy and charity giving rather than a sustainable program. Like money has to be brought in from outside and layered on top, and what's the best way to do that? And there is a difference between like this is given to you because you're needy from someone who doesn't, as opposed to like the dividend governmental approach thing where like this is your share of the economy. Like we have a system in place under a UBI, like a way to view it is that I think is better than we give everybody money. It's more like everyone starts with some money because we just have that built in systemically, like out of the GDP or the revenue or whatever. We just make sure everyone starts at a certain place. So you're not being given it. It just is yours. You know, that I think is an important distinction to make and sort of flavors like what the meaning of these studies are and like what the impetus is. GiveDirectly is a philanthropic organization and they do some of the best work in the world, but they're also not a governmental organization meant to be so much sustainable as to deliver foreign aid.
Yeah, a lot of these philanthropists, it's like they're thinking, what can I do that I never have to think about these people again? You know?
I mean,
Like,
yeah.
like that's what they're doing. And, you know, it would be nice if what they were doing were thinking, okay, so this is what we determined, like in Kenya, whoa, look at how well this monthly income works in like if you trust people and they're able, you know, education works better and housing improves and all this stuff. And so maybe we should help Kenya set up basic income, you know, like let's actually help this government actually turn this into a permanent program. But instead, a lot of it is thinking, what if we just give them this? And then do we never have to do anything ever again? And it's a very different way of looking at things.
I actually think that might be a brilliant way to pitch UBI and like commingle. Like we talk about commingle as a set it and forget it model, right? This world of like competing for your attention with poverty and outrage porn and all of this stuff where it's like, you know, I'm concerned about the people in Gaza, or I'm concerned about the people in Rwanda or South Sudan or here. And there's all this sort of like virtue signaling and moral, like one-upsmanship. It's like, you're not even talking about the people in Yemen. And it's like, like we're not built to be able to consider 8 billion people all the time and all the suffering going on everywhere. It's just fucking impossible. And we have this pressure to try to do that. And it's like, well, what about plastics? You know, you just supported something that isn't as plastic conscious. And I care about all these things. So I want there to be a way where, you know, the 8 billion people on the planet and all the different issues, like I'm doing something about all of them without having to think about them ever again. Like, and that's kind of what a UBI is. It's like anyone who is on the front lines of any issue is now more empowered to sort of deal with it. Right. And maybe you still need to like spare extra attention for some sort of crisis or something somewhere, like what's going on in Jamaica, whatever. And even that, it's easier to send money now if you have UBI systems everywhere. But I also want to I want to know that like the greater system is kind of working for people everywhere. And now I can focus on me and my household and my community, knowing that it's not at the expense of others. Like I am not a winner in a system with losers. I'm just in a system that like I can focus on myself without being morally negligent.
Yeah, I mean, wherever someone is a citizen, or the country that they're a citizen of should be making sure that they have basic income that everyone does. It's just we can't just look at all this data and say, oh no, that's all this, it's a temporary thing, just you do it here and there. This needs just to be structural. It needs to be permanent. And it would just be so much more effective if these countries where GiveDirectly is doing all this impactful stuff, they actually just look at it and go, wow, thank you for all these people in other countries to help show us that you should be doing this permanently. Like, we can do this. It's not like they can't. Like, all these countries, they've got, they're rich in resources and they've got high inequality. People are getting rich off that, but they're not doing it. Like, you need like to do kind of an Alaska model kind of situation in a bunch of these countries that are poor, but they're poor because they're actually just not making sure that people are benefiting from that natural wealth and everything else, and they're being held down from developing.
This kind of brings me back to something I wrote down before. We were talking about like sovereign wealth fund type stuff with Alaska. There's like two different types of society, essentially, like whether you're a higher income society or a lower income society in general, where the US, we could afford a basic income for our population. Maybe in a certain place in the developing world, they couldn't and would need it to be subsidized, right? And to me, I wonder about this idea of sovereign wealth funds, if that becomes a thing that proliferates, where if someone's sovereign wealth fund is too small, some nation's sovereign wealth fund is too small, it could get sort of like support from all the other countries, and thereby be like an international basic income so that each country has enough redistributed wealth to make sure they have enough footing to do their best, right? And then does that in and of itself like radically reduce war? Like if people aren't struggling for basic necessities at the individual or the national level and resources, then are we able to have more international collaboration as opposed to competition?
Yeah, and you could use this as a way of making sure that the money is actually going to people. Like, you could use as leverage. Like, so as an example, let's say Alaska was poor, or maybe let's say Alaska just needs some additional help and a bunch of other countries want to help or something because maybe Trump is refusing to help Alaska. I don't know. But let's just say some other country decides to double the size of Alaska's permanent fund. They're like, we want to actually help people in Alaska permanently, so we're adding a bunch of money to the permanent fund. If they did that now, it wouldn't actually guarantee that the dividend increases, because Alaska went away from their usual measurement model where they took like an average of 5 years and then the payment depended on that average. And like now the politicians decided to start meddling with it themselves. And so, this year it was $1,000, even though it should have been like around, I think, over $4,000 if they had used the traditional way of going about it. So yeah, some other country could go, we aren't going to give this money to this permanent fund unless it's guaranteed that, in the Constitution or something or whatever, that it is going to the people. Like, it's just, that is the place that you put the money, and then it distributes.
And the amount is determined by like some sort of moving metric and algorithm or whatever, where it's like, this is not something we fight about in Congress every year or 5 years or 15 years. This is like, we are setting it at X% of median or mean income or GDP or whatever, and then that'll keep moving. And the only thing we have left to fight about is, do we want to change that percentage? Right. But it is a percentage that moves like with a rising or falling tide. And then we can see how that's working with, instead of having this like endless debate about how much is the right amount, we have a percentage, and if it's not set up that way, there's a lot of room for politicians to meddle, like in Alaska. Like, if it's not like in the constitution of the Alaska dividend that it's, a 5-year average.
It's something that Alaska still they need to add it to the Constitution.
One of my favorite, like I've had my issues with Stephanie Kelton in the past, but she kind of reminded me of the Henry Ford thing, like your consumers have to have money. And this, one of the things I've taken from her and forward all the time is like this idea of job creators. Job creators don't create jobs. Like, I've run businesses. We didn't create those jobs. Like, we found space for them and pursued them. Jobs are created by demand. It's the people who are the job creators are the consumers, and the people who like facilitate that, like the CEOs or whatever that start these companies and do great stuff and risk all this stuff. They didn't create those jobs. They just saw that there was room for them to exist. And if if there wasn't demand, if there wasn't money flowing, if there wasn't a consumer base that could spend money on things, there's nothing a job creator can do to like make those jobs appear. You have to have demand. So like a big part about UBI that people are missing when they talk about the cost or the expense or whatever is that another cost of not having UBI is that like eventually the economy eats itself and can't keep going. When Jeff Bezos owns us all, no one makes any money anywhere. No one buys anything anywhere unless he starts giving us all that money back. Like that simple example, imagine Jeff Bezos is king and Amazon brings us everything. Well, in order for us to buy his products, he has to give us some of that money back. And then extrapolate that to like a more nuanced, like we have a million kings or whatever.
Yeah, we're in a really weird place right now where the amount of economic activity it's being generated, we're a 70% consumer-based economy, but in just this year, like suddenly there's more contribution to the economy coming from the computer center investments. That's what our economy is in this moment right now, is we're just building up all this AI infrastructure. And does that help people? Is that creating jobs? No, it's eliminating jobs, even though it's making some people a lot of money. NVIDIA just became, I think, a $5 trillion company today after just massive growth over the past couple of years. So yeah, it's crazy that you can't run an economy building computer centers.
Right.
It's not going to work.
And where's the tipping point where enough people are like, I can no longer cling to this idea of a meritocracy where if like I just figure it out enough and I stop being so pathetic at whatever I'm doing, then I'll succeed, and I just need to write self-help books or whatever. Like at what point do people finally wake up and be like, all right, $500 billion is too many billions of dollars for one person. Now, okay, I'm starting to see, like, because I have nothing and there's no way for me to get anything. And then
I mean, Elon is basically threatening to quit Tesla unless he gets $1 trillion from the board. Like he's demanding to be a trillionaire.
Scott. Are you saying he doesn't deserve it? I mean, all right, we should end on some note like that because I'm getting a call in 2 minutes.
All right. Well, no, we can just end it now. Maybe, okay, we'll end it, let's say here is appropriate. Just a quick glance at this headline. Encourage people to read this. This is written by actually a donor to Income to Support All Foundation, Scott Ellis. He's, I'm a millionaire. No one needs more than $30 million. And in this opinion piece for Time, he recommends that we actually just tax people. We tax 50% of wealth past $30 million. So that, there's still the ability to earn additional wealth after that. You can still be a billionaire if half of your wealth is taxed. Even then, like you just don't need it. Like a $30 million, he argues in this, is plenty. Again, just massive inequality. But there are 225,000 individuals in the U.S. with net assets of $30 million or more, which is 0.07% of the population. So he's also just saying, look, we should tax 0.0% of the population at a 50% rate, and not just income, but wealth. And that'll still work just fine. Like people can still be rich. They just won't be trillionaire rich, or at least they won't as easily become trillionaires.
Right.
So, so I just encourage people to read this.
That would be a big source of revenue towards things, and it would bring down equality right quick, especially if it was put towards UBI, where basically if you're over $30 million, it gets you back towards $30 million quickly. It would also disincentivize people just gobbling up shitloads of real estate because that's not liquid. I think there's other ways we could accomplish that too. I think there's a lot interesting there. I think I would encourage people, barring this, to like think in terms of yourself. If you're one of us temporarily embarrassed millionaires, imagining that someday you'll hit it big or your idea will happen. My wife and I, even though it'll probably never come to this, thought about this at one point after we were fundraising from all kinds of rich people. Is like, okay, where do we impose our own wealth cap to keep ourselves from ever becoming extractive from society? And we set it at like $10 million. Like his was 30, ours was 10 million in 2020. It's like, essentially it's like, at what level do I feel ridiculous if I have more money? Like anything I could possibly want to do. And if different people have different needs. If you want to be starting businesses all the time and funding movies, maybe that's why we came up with 10 million. It's like, I don't want to be out hustling for our seed money for the next project we do for 3 years again. I want to be like, oh, it's a good idea. Let's start. But if you're,
Maybe we should put a cap on the size of yachts, like, because that's something too, where instead of like having too much wealth, it's like if you're to the point where you're looking around and you need your yacht to be 6 feet longer than someone else's yacht.
Well, it depends. If my yacht is 10 feet,
you're
then
too wealthy.
6 feet longer is a pretty big upgrade.
Right, but there's a limit that's acceptable, right? Like there's some size yacht that's okay, right, that we don't need to go larger than that. Like you don't need a helipad. You really don't need a helipad. I'm sorry.
Barring a governmental solution, like if I was a guru for the wealthy, like some people are, I would say pick your wealth cap and fucking get there. And it's really hard if you have $100 billion, give away all that money, which is why we're building commingles to give people a mechanism. But basically, if the government's not going to do it and you're like, I'm a patriotic millionaire, tax me more. Tax yourself. Just get it out. If you don't know how to do it, we'll have an answer for you in the next year or so.
Yeah, right now, like we're in this weird situation where people are voluntarily giving some of their wealth to Trump to like spend on his White House ballroom and or the military paychecks or whatever. Like we're in that zone. If someone wanted to support basic income and they wanted to give money to the US government, wouldn't do it. You can't do that. It's not even an option. So yeah, we want to make that option outside of government where someone can just go, I want to make sure that my money goes to everyone equally.
Is there a place they could give money now to know that it would go towards universal basic income? Is there some sort of foundation?
Checking out itsafoundation.org and just my recent blog post too about walking the walk. I encourage everyone, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. Like if you believe in basic income, start supporting it now. Don't wait until you're finally taxed. Like you can actually help right now.
Yeah. Links in the description.
Links in the description. Thank you all for watching. We will catch you next time. Be sure to like and subscribe and share with others. Encourage others to subscribe to the channel and watch all the other stuff that we've got. A lot of episodes to go through. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.